Hello, everybody. Welcome to lesson 5. In this lesson, we're going to talk about sampling and research. If you think back to the beginning of this class, we talked briefly about the importance of sampling when trying to infer things to the general population. And so that's what we're going to talk about here in this lesson. So why do researchers use sampling? Well, it's often impractical to study an entire population of interest. So instead, researchers will draw a sample from that population to study. Now, the sample is studied, and researchers then are able to infer or generalize that their findings in the sample would be true in the population. Now, the generalization to the population will only be as good as the method in which the sample is obtained, and that's a very important one. It's not just simply a matter of going out and getting a population or getting a sample from a population, but you need to ensure that that sample is representative of the entire population. So let's go forward and talk about some examples. So here are some examples of sampling. In this first example with college students, if you wanted to do a study looking at certain beliefs about college students, it'd be unrealistic to sample every college student in the United States. However, you could use SIUE students in this age range, 18 to 25 years of age, and study them and then generalize that to an entire group of college students. There's other examples here in CrossFit participants or type 2 diabetics where you're trying to infer from a smaller sample to a larger population. The reason is, again, using a sample is important is because it's unrealistic and very costly if you're trying to study an entire population. So that's why sampling is so important. So there are two different types of sampling, unbiased versus biased sampling. And unbiased sampling, also known as probability, occurs when a researcher gives every single member of a population an equal chance of being included in the sample. That might be easily done when you have a smaller population. However, another type is called a biased, which is non-probability sample, where it occurs when a researcher is unable to give every single member of a population an equal chance of being included in the sample, either because it isn't feasible, for example, a population is much too large, or the researchers cannot identify all members of the population. Let's dive a little bit more deeper into both of these, beginning with an unbiased sampling. So again, let's talk about unbiased sampling strategies. So in a simple random sample unbiased, every member of a population, for example, 12,000 people, has an equal chance of being included in the sample. For example, option 1, you could put names on slips of paper and place them in a box, randomly draw names from the box until the desired sample size is created. Option 2 is assign each member of the population number from 0 all the way to 12,000, then use a random number table generator to generate a table of numbers desired sample size that correspond to the unique numbers assigned to the population. Well, either one can be effective at getting a sample size from an entire population. And again, this link will take you to a random number generator spreadsheet that will kind of help with developing a table that could be used in developing a random sample. So another type of random sampling is systematic. And this is using the same study population as we just talked about, but researchers would obtain a complete list of the 12,000 members of the population and then select a random number which is represented as K. But in this case, let's say every 8th individual the person would select. Well, this can be easily done in Excel or Word, but it does take time. And some stat softwares, SPSS, may make this process much faster. But here's important to keep in mind. If there's a systematic bias, in other words, every 8th person is male, for example, you would need to go back to a simple random sample. But this is, again, an example of another option for random sampling. Well, another type of random sampling is called stratified. And so using our same example, the researcher would separate the 12,000 members of the population into strata. So in other words, they would divide them up maybe by gender, race, income level. And these are predetermined based on the desire to ensure the sample is representative of the population. And that's what you get a stratified random sample. You want to make sure that the population the sample is representative of the population of whole. Now, you could perform a simple random sample or a systematic random sample from each strata until the desired number of participants are reached in each strata, usually a percentage of the entire sample. Well, let's continue with this using the SIUE example. So let's use this stratified random sample as an example. Let's say you want to determine, looking at a sample of both grad student populations at SIUE, and you want a representative of both females and males. You can see there's over 2,400 grad students at SIUE, and it breaks down about 60% female and 40% male. Now, your desired sample size is about 400. So in order to get a stratified random sample in terms of making sure it's gender representative, 60-40, you would need about 240 females and about 160 males to get that 60 to 40% distribution of the entire SIUE population. Another type of sampling is called cluster random sample. And it's the most common approach to use is a geographic cluster. And the idea behind this, it may be unfeasible to do because of a defined geographic location to study the entire population. So you would actually do a geographical cluster in terms of the focus on a particular area of the United States, or maybe a region, or even a city. And this would give you an idea of what it might be like in that particular cluster. And the way you do this, there's 3 different stages. You would first divide the entire population into different clusters. Then you would select a number of clusters through simple or systematic random sampling. And then researchers can stop and survey everyone in each cluster, which could be very expensive and time consuming, or select a number of participants from each cluster through simple or systematic random sampling that we've just previously talked about. Now, again, this cluster sampling can be expensive and time consuming, but it would give you a more focused area of sample in the geographic location that you were talking about. So here's an example of cluster random sampling using Illinois. First, I would select clusters throughout the state of Illinois, hoping that they would be representative of Illinois, but then I would randomly select 50 individuals from each of the clusters. And then I would hope that those 50 individuals of each would be representative of each cluster, and that each cluster then would be representative of the state of Illinois. So that's the idea of doing cluster random sampling. It takes geographic locations, and then you're able to then randomly assign or select populations from that cluster. So now let's move our attention to biased sampling strategies. And the first of which, and the most common in our field, is convenient sample. And with convenient sample, it's often used when an entire population is inaccessible. So what researchers do is they recruit from those who are available, who are convenient. Well, only people who are willing and able to participate volunteer for the study, which is a major source of bias, because you can imagine that there might be a difference in terms of individuals who want to participate versus those who do not want to participate. Well, the way to get around this, or potential control for it in some way, is that researchers can and should establish some inclusionary and exclusionary criteria to be sure they obtain an appropriate sample. However, even with these criteria, it's difficult to generalize findings to an entire population of interest because of the difference between those who want to participate versus those who do not. But again, this is one of the more common use research sampling styles. Well, another type of sampling is called the quota sampling. Now, quota sampling is similar to stratified random sampling. However, there's no random aspect to it. Now, quotas may be related to characteristics such as gender, race, income, etc. And the idea behind this is you would create quotas of the number needed in that sample based on these particular characteristics. Then you would select people conveniently for each of the quota until desired number is reached. Now, there's a lack of random selection to this, which can limit your generalizability, but is more representative than a simple convenient sample So there are some give and take and some decision making by the researcher in terms of what would be the best sampling. Well, another type of research is called purposive sampling. Now, researchers may want to recruit unique individuals into a study. For example, athletes who have won a gold medal in the Olympics. So you can imagine this population would be very difficult to find. So the researcher will attempt to zero in on the target population and recruit whoever is available. So again, you're trying to purposefully find those individuals who would qualify for your study because it's such a unique characteristics of the population you're looking for. Now, one way to help with this recruitment process is use a snowball sample, which is an extension of the purposive sample. For example, researchers will ask a participant who's already in the study to agree to be in the study to ask similar others to be in the study. An example might be bodybuilders. You're recruiting bodybuilders who have won particular awards. Well, those bodybuilders then will go out and recruit other bodybuilders. So this idea is that the sample will grow like a snowball as it picks up new people. However, there are situations where you might be doing a particular health disease risk that an individual in the study may not be able to recognize other people who may have that characteristic. So in this particular case, a snowball sampling would be difficult to do. But this is an example where it might be a purposive sample, something very unique that you're trying to recruit a particular population. So let's move our attention to recruiting the sample, some things to consider when you're trying to actually recruit the sample for your research. Well, there are several methods of recruitment. The first is when you have potential methods for unbiased samples. And if you remember, when an unbiased sample is when you're trying to recruit every member of the population. So in this case, you'd have to have every member of the population's contact information. For example, their email, address, their physical address, their phone number, or they would potentially go face-to-face contact with each member of the population. So you can imagine this would have to be a small population that we're talking about because the manpower or the people required to do this would be difficult and time-consuming. However, potential methods for bias samples would be as listed: email or post email, social media, flyers, word of mouth, website, or even cold calling on the phone. But this would be dictated based on the amount of resources you have and also the amount of time that you have. So consider some methods of recruitment, whether it's unbiased, where you recruit the entire population from the entire population, or it might be from a bias sample where you're trying to recruit from a smaller population or a group from a larger population. So when recruiting a sample, you need to take into consideration the characteristics of that sample or the demographics. And these might include such things as age, race, gender, income, education, and any other factor that's relevant to the purpose of the study. Now, this information is collected in order to provide a description of the sample in the research report so other researchers can determine whether the results of the study might be generalized to the population, or they may want to replicate the study. So it'd be important for those demographics to be explicit in the research study and in the manuscript. Now, research can also use this information to make a statistical adjustment, such as weighting. So let's say there might be a particular area of the sample. This weighting might be better represent the population of interest. So there are some statistical measures that you can do if you have one particular area that you want to focus your attention on. And let's go on to that example. So here's an example of the characteristics of the sample. So let's say a researcher is interested in conducting a study about the exercise behavior of graduate students. So she recruits a simple random sample of grad students from SIUE to complete a web-based questionnaire. Now, after all the data are collected, only 20% of the sample is male, yet the university indicates the grad student population is 40% male. She decides to give a statistical weight to males in the study by counting the responses twice. This boosts the percentage of males from 20% to 40% in the sample, making the sample more representative. So essentially what the researcher has done is found that her sample size was about half of representative actual males at SIUE. So she simply ended up doubling the responses of each of the males. Now, this simple approach works best for an unbiased sample. For a bias sample, this approach may double any bias that may have been introduced by the lack of random selection of participants. So for example, in our example above, where you had 20% males from the actual participants, where in fact the entire population was 40%, by doubling it, you basically double the bias because you're giving weight twice the amount for actual each male participant. In an unbiased sample, it may be best to simply acknowledge the samples differ from the population it was drawn from in some way. For example, we would say that the males are underrepresented in the sample, and we would just acknowledge that. And that might make it, the limitation of this, it might limit our ability to generalize it to the entire population. But sometimes it's best just to either admit that there might not be the population that you've decided on or for your study is not representative, or you'd have to do some weighting as we described, where you maybe in this case would double the responses by males. Now let's talk about sample size. Let's say you know what type of sample and how you're going to recruit that sample. Well, an important question after is who do I want to recruit for my study, and how many participants do I need? Well, let's take a look at this. So let's say, for example, you want to do a pilot study. Well, pilot studies are basically smaller sample sizes, usually 10 to 100 participants. And the purpose of the pilot study is to obtain preliminary data on how treatments or measures work in preparation for a larger study. So for example, let's say you want to determine the effects of a certain type of resistance study, and by doing so, you would recruit a small number of participants, and you could potentially collect both quantitative data to find out if there are any changes, but also qualitative data to find out what worked and what didn't work. And this would allow you to make adjustments for the larger subsequent study that you might be about to do. Another way to think about the size of the sample is how expensive it might be to do the study. So let's say, for example, you might be measuring hormones in salivary glands or potential in the blood. Well, you can imagine it can be very expensive to use a large population to do so. And it can be very time consuming. So you would need to have a smaller sample size, and it potentially would be based on the amount of resources you would have available. Well, there are times where small sample sizes are not adequate for rare events. So for example, let's say you had a rare genetic mutation in about 25 people from around the globe. Well, trying to take 25 individuals just from your general population would be unrealistic to find that genetic mutation. So what you would need to do is work around the globe, working with a team of researchers who would have access to a population and be able to recruit individuals with potentially that rare genetic mutation. Also, there might be situations where a small sample size is adequate, is if there's a minimal variability in the population. For example, it's homogeneous. Then a small sample size may suffice. Let's say there might be a particular characteristics that is representative of everybody. In that particular case, a smaller sample size would be adequate. Also, if there's likely to be a lot of individual variance in research on human behavior, cognition, emotion, attitudes, and opinions, thus larger sample size may be needed if cost permitting. So there might be, depending on what the researcher is studying, if there's going to be a lot of individual differences, and working with humans there generally is, then it'll be feasible, or at least it'll be advisable, that a larger population, a larger sample size is recruited in order to tease out those differences in human behavior, emotion, etc. But again, you'd have to weigh the options of the amount of cost to the potential generalizability. Finally, if the researcher wants to be able to capture small differences in the population, small variances, then they will need a larger sample size. There might be instances where a large sample size, you may be able to tease out small changes in, say, blood pressure with exercise. You may have very small changes, but in order to detect those changes, you would need a very large population to do so. But again, small changes in blood pressure may have meaningful impact on one's health. So these are just some of the examples that we went through, that you have to weigh the pros and the cons of the type of sample size in determining the type of research question that you're trying to answer. Now, there are ways to calculate sample size. Researchers can use the tables like the one here. And the idea here is that it can be well defined. So, but it's only if the population is well defined. So for example, let's say you knew that the entire population represented by N is 10 individuals, then you would need a sample size of 10 to represent that entire population. But let's say, for example, you have a population of 220. Well, then you would need to calculate a sample size of 140 in order to get a representative sample of that entire population of 220. And finally, let's say an entire population is 1,200, well, then you would need to have a sample size of 291. And the idea here is this gives you, this table can be used to determine the sample size needed to represent the entire population of interest. Now, there might be other ways, there are other ways that you can do this using a calculator called G-Power to determine sample size if the population size is unknown. So in other words, if you don't know the exact size of the population, well, you can use G-Power. And here's an example or a link to G-Power. And you can download this G-Power calculator from this link here. And it's simply, you would just plug in some information about the population of interest, and then what you're trying to study. And then from there, it would then generate a number or a sample size that you would need to have in your study to be representative of the entire population that you're interested in. And you can also, if there's any questions, you can, there are many tutorials on YouTube that can be used. Just simply search G-Power calculator, and that can give you some further details. Well, this concludes the information for sampling size for this lesson. Make sure that you review the information in this in the PowerPoints and also the lecture before doing the quiz.